very important things that I would like to bring to your attention. The first is, of course, the devastating news from Florida after the building collapse. The shock felt thousands of miles away here in Sydney, as we heard yesterday with immense sadness that the rescue workers found Svi and Itty Ainsworth, a beloved couple who lived in Australia for nearly 20 years, are among the people confirmed killed in the building disaster. Throughout these traumatic few weeks, it has been heartening to hear of the incredible and tireless work of a team of Weiser, Florida sisters on the ground from moments after the collapse of the building. These women, many with their spouses, have been assisting those affected and the frontline workers with food, clothing, offer of shelter to those who have lost everything. In addition, they have been working with the Shuls of Bal Harbour, many of whom have also been on the front line assisting wherever they can. It's moments like these that we realise the reach of Weiser, not just for fundraising for our beloved Israel, but joining together wherever the need is greatest and helping those in the greatest need. We've also received a disturbing report from Israel just this past weekend that COVID-19 has seen an 800% increase in domestic violence complaints and a 26% increase in requests for help for domestic violence victims to social centres, welfare centres, and all the other shelters that Weiser provide. Anita Friedman, our World Weiser chairperson, was quoted as saying, "The findings are grave and require immediate and deep reforms." She continued by saying 200,000 women are living with domestic violence, which means that 600,000 children, just under 1 million right now, are living in Israel with this terrible daily threat to their lives. She concluded by saying that she calls on the new government to take this matter seriously and to make sure that they find proper solution to these growing stats. Weiser is leading the battle in both domestic violence and gender-based violence, in education, prevention, treatment, legislation, and advocacy. Our shelters and our halfway houses are all over Israel, and the need is constant. We'll bring you more on that as Israel updates us. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me or the Weiser office. Dr. Ron Weiser, AM. Ron, how blessed we are that you count Weiser as an organisation so close to your heart. Your ongoing insight and knowledge in the area of Israeli politics is a godsend to us mere mortals who really want to understand the complexities of Israel's political system. As this is now a very unique situation which Israel finds itself in, we are looking forward to listening, learning, and understanding. Tonight is definitely our largest Zoom ever, with over 200 participants. And over to you with our grateful Weiser thanks, Dr. Ron Weiser.
Well, thank you very much, Di. I first wanted to say, actually, listening to what the introduction that you gave about Weiser, that I really wished we lived in a world that we didn't need Weiser, because then we'd live in a real idyllic world. And I think that it's a tribute to what Weiser does in the areas of domestic violence, in an area of women's rights, in all those areas that you're so active in, that nobody else is really leading the fight in. And I think it's a testimony to all of you involved in Weiser and all the people on this call, you know, who should really be supporting exactly what Weiser is doing. And again, it's one of those organizations I hope we can work towards eliminating, so that there wouldn't be a need for these things in the future. But sadly there is, and COVID has brought forth a greater emergency, certainly within the family homes. So coming to the topic for the evening, I'm going to do what I normally do, which is to start off with a PowerPoint, and just load that up. And you should be able to see the PowerPoint now. So I haven't looked at the news in the last few hours. I hope the government still is standing. They said it couldn't last. It's been now nearly its 4th week. It was formally approved on the 13th of June, and it faces almost daily challenges. And before we really get into it, I just want to bring what almost faced it straight away. As you know, it came to power straight after the war with Hamas. And let's overlook for a moment the shocking headline in the Australian, of all places. But just 3 days after it came into existence, Hamas launched these incendiary balloons into Israel. And Israel responded with airstrikes. Now, that was not the policy of Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu did not respond to balloons with airstrikes. He used a lower level of response. And this government, in a way to make its mark, but also to show that it wasn't weak, hit back much more strongly than Netanyahu. And it's interesting that Hamas decided not to escalate it from there. And to give you another taste, another policy of the Netanyahu government was to allow Qatar to hand through Israel to Gaza millions of dollars in cash, literally cash in suitcases. And here's an indication of the change in worldview, because those of you who think Israel's PR was poor during the war with Hamas, it's not exactly so. Certainly not at governmental level. Even the United Nations was backing Israel in refusing to just pass these, bags of cash through. And nobody bought the fact that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, because the head of the UN in Gaza had clearly stated that there wasn't. So just a little example of some of the changes in policy, and then again an example of some of the non-changes in policy, where Israel didn't allow Qatari money into Gaza, but it allowed Qatar to pay for the fuel that it supplied to Gaza, and it made it conditional on the preservation of security and stability. Well, we'll see if they can hold that red line. But just 3 days into its government, it really made a very positive start, a strong start, and we'll see if that's a portent of things to come. In every talk, those of you who've heard me speak before know I put a variation of this slide in, because we shouldn't forget what it is we're all on about. And the question, of course, is what is Zionism? And it's really about Jews securing and determining the fate of the Jewish people. And the Jewish state, the state of Israel, is the vehicle for that task. And what we need to make sure is that that vehicle is in working order in order to carry out its aims. And you'll see that all of the examples that I bring of the challenges to this government really revolve around how that Jewish state can operate for the purposes of securing the Jewish future. I think it's important to see that nowadays, this old division of left and right is not quite what it used to be, because, today you can be left on one issue and right on another issue. It's not a black and white issue. And there is, of course, the external situation, which, people talk about this government being 8 different parties with right across the spectrum, which is true in one way and less true in others. So the external situation we'll come to later on. But really, any divisions in the external situation is not about now, it's about the future. And maybe they can push that down the track. But the real task of this government initially are the many internal issues. For 2 years, Israel hasn't had a budget. So, the first thing is to actually pass a budget. But this government can unite around socioeconomic issues, gay rights, religious status quo changes, reforming the electoral process, many, many other things that this government can work on, where the left-right divide doesn't really permeate it to the same degree. So just remind you, these are the results of the elections. In Israel, voting is optional. Voter turnout of 67.4%, which is very high by Western standards. About 36,000 votes gets you a seat in the Knesset. All of the red parties are part of the government. They're the 8 parties. Lapid clearly were the biggest party. Now, Naftali Bennett did win 7 seats in the election, but only 6 seats supported him in the formation of the government. And we've discussed before, but the dentist, Mansour Abbas, heading the Ram Party, an Islamist party with its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, here it is participating in the government of the State of Israel. They have 4 members. 1 abstained in the vote of confidence, didn't vote against. And so that's why I wrote that in 3. But as you look at I'm not going to go through the parties, but as you look at them, 7 of the 8 parties are actually generally liberal and very progressive. And that's the majority of them. Ironically, the only party that isn't is the Israeli Arab Party, Ram, which is a chauvinistic, homophobic, conservative party. But all of the Zionist parties, or all of the so-called Jewish parties, are generally liberal and progressive on all of the issues that we mentioned previously. And I think the other important thing to remember is that actually 5 of the 8 parties are generally to the right on external issues. Of course, where you only get into government on a confidence vote of 60 to 59, even one party can bring you down, or even a member of one party. So, but still, the general trend of this government has some degree of unity in quite a few areas. So, you know, it's Jews who talk about, particularly Jews in the diaspora, whether they're Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis. And, 2 years ago at Limud Oz, I was on a panel with an Israeli Jewish journalist from Haaretz who insisted on calling people Palestinian Israelis. I said, who are you talking about? Arab citizens of Israel? She said, yes. Well, they want to be Israeli Arabs. And there are two Israeli Arab parties in the Knesset, one led by Ayman Odeh, he's in the opposition, and of course, the other one, Mansour Abbas. And it was Mansour Abbas who took it further and really made, I think, a watershed change in Israeli politics. He made that classic statement, I, Mansour Abbas, a man of the Islamic movement. That's an important part of his statement. I'm a proud Arab and Muslim, a citizen of the state of Israel. I mean, there's no question in his mind that he's an Israeli Arab. He's not a Palestinian Israeli. And he had three demands to join this government, and mostly all very pragmatic demands, and mostly not controversial inside Israel at all. All the parties who joined put their ideological platform aside, and it's to be seen if that will percolate through later on or not. The first thing that he wanted was Israeli Arab organized crime needs to be dealt with. This is Israeli Arab mafia killing Israeli Arabs. There's been approximately 54 deaths so far this year. Last week, a 49-year-old Bedouin woman was shot dead in a southern Bedouin town. She had nothing to do with the dispute. She was caught in a crossfire between two Arab gangs, and Israeli Arabs want to stop living in fear in their own towns. So this is one of his demands, that Israel should focus on dealing with Israeli Arab organized crime, not a controversial demand. Now, the pandemic, we'll leave aside the negative side of it, but it brought one very positive outcome. With so many people in Israel in hospital and so many people being dealt with by the health system, it actually brought Jew and Arab closer together than in previous times. When you went to the hospital, many of the nurses were Israeli Arabs, many of the doctors were Israeli Arabs, Jew was treating Arab, Arab was treating Jew, and it helped to break down quite a lot of the barriers. And Israeli Arabs are demanding a better shape of the budget. They want better infrastructure in their towns and in the shared towns. And they have a right to ask for that and to demand that, and they have a right to receive that. And it's not even controversial inside Israel. It's a budgetary question, and everyone in Israel, within the government certainly, but even in the opposition, Likud certainly as well, is committed to this. So they're non-controversial demands. The slightly controversial demand that I would argue it's not is, the Bedouins in the north are domiciled, the Bedouins in the south are still very largely nomadic. Israel is trying to put them into towns. They form shanty towns and unrecognized towns. And part of Mansour Abbas's demand is that 3 of the unauthorized Bedouin towns be recognized as proper towns and therefore receiving governmental support, et cetera, et cetera. And after all, they have to live somewhere. So it's not a really controversial issue. And I think it's something that nobody really had trouble agreeing to. Whether it can be delivered upon and how well it will be delivered upon will really determine whether Mansour Abbas comes out of this a hero to his people or not. And I think that the Israeli government has an obligation to try and do its best to deal with these 3 critical issues. Now, I want to remind you that Hamas pushed for a ceasefire in the war a few days before Israel was willing to give it, because they'd already achieved their demands. One was to take leadership of the Palestinians and to show that they were the defenders of Jerusalem. But the other was to stop Mansour Abbas from joining an Israeli government. Indeed, the day of the ceasefire, after the ceasefire began, it began at 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday, later that day, the Hamas leader said, this battle has destroyed the project of coexistence with the Israeli occupation, of the project normalization with Israel. In other words, they felt they had stopped Mansour Abbas joining an Israeli government. A couple of weeks later, he joins the government. And I think that that gave Hamas its biggest defeat in reality of this recent battle or recent war. And I think that that's something that is extremely important and a bit undersold in our understanding here. But this was really a defeat for Hamas. and a win for Israel. So we should look at the government. It is led by Naftali Bennett, but the dominating partner is really Yair Lapid. Firstly, let's look at Naftali Bennett. First time Israel has a kippah-wearing prime minister. Now, in Israel, the size of your kippah and the type of the kippah does say something about you, and he has a small kippah, and his wife is less observant. But he perfectly encapsulates as a high-tech entrepreneur. He perfectly encapsulates an aspirational aspects of Israeli life. As I said, as a high-tech entrepreneur, as somebody who melds religious life with secular life and so on and so forth, who has a blended family in a way. And he really is, in that sense, a great symbol to lead the country. To remind you that he is a politician, just before the election, of his own bat on national television, he wrote and produced a document which he signed on national television, where he stated, I won't allow Yair Lapid to be prime minister, including in a rotation agreement, and I will not establish a government based on the support of Mansour Abbas from the Islamic movement. And yet he did both of those things. So you can pay him credit for being pragmatic, but this was his path to prime ministership. He, of course, rationalized why it was okay to do so. At the end of the day, we are dealing with politicians, and I think that we have to understand the balance. And Yair Lapid, who I give the greater credit to in this government, he's one who made it happen. There's no small degree of self-sacrifice in what he did. He didn't put himself forward as prime minister because he knew that wouldn't work. In order to entice Bennett, he offered him the prime ministership. But at the end of the day, Lapid will come out of this politically much better because because Bennett, he's seen by, he only had a small constituency to begin with, and at least half, if not more, according to opinion polls, have deserted him now, saying that he, brought down Netanyahu and so on and so forth. Whereas Lapid is getting great credit in the opinion polls for his modesty. He didn't put his ego first, put the country first. And whether he gets to be prime minister in 2 years' time or not, he probably did benefit politically out of it. And I think the most important thing about this government to understand is in these 8 parties is that all of the parties have signed their coalition agreements with Lapid, not with Bennett. The only party that signed a coalition deal with Bennett is Lapid. So all 7 parties signed a deal with Lapid. So he's the glue that holds this together, and he will be the one that the parties will come to if they feel that whatever coalition agreements they got didn't work. So behind it all is sitting that Lapid's leadership. Now, Bennett, of course, will try his best to show that he's a great prime minister because he needs time to do that in order to be re-elected at all, let alone as prime minister. So they have an interest to try and keep this government going themselves. And I think that also is positive when politicians have some self-interest involved. Now, coming to the external situation, and I always say this, despite the ideological noise, there's only 2 considerations by and large. One is demography, that we should have as large a Jewish population as possible within the final borders of the state of Israel. And 2, that entity, the Jewish vehicle that's going to determine our destiny, will be secure, will be able to do it, not only just to survive, but to thrive. And we call that catch 67, that since 1967, we've been in this catch 67, trying to keep a Jewish majority, at the same time wanting security. If we give up territory, will we have security? And the real question is how to separate from the Palestinians securely. It's not about ideology. That's really what it comes down to. At the end of the ceasefire, President Biden made a rather outstanding statement. First Democrat president to make such a statement. Now, I want to take you back to 2004, just before the disengagement from Gaza. There was an exchange of letters between Prime Minister Sharon and President George W. Bush. And it was on that basis that Sharon got out of Gaza. And it was the first time the Americans had formally committed to Israel as a Jewish state. Till then, the Americans had recognized Israel as the state of Israel, but they recognized Israel finally as a Jewish state. Now, that has ramifications beyond what we're going to talk about today. But there is a huge difference to recognizing the state of Israel or to recognizing the state of Israel as a Jewish state. And that's what Sharon got out of getting out of Gaza. And there was a price to pay for that as well. And the price was that there's no shift, says Biden, in my commitment to the security of Israel, no shift period. What we still need is a two-state solution. It's the only answer. Now, Sharon agreed to that and Bibi agreed to that, because if you want to have a large Jewish majority in the state of Israel, you have to have somewhere to put those Palestinians that you don't want inside the state of Israel. Now, whether that's a state or some entity or whatever, they have to go somewhere. So the paradigm that we have always accepted is that there should be, some sort of sharing. But we should be a separation, but we need to be secure. The question is how to do that. Now, as I said, Biden, after the ceasefire, gave Israel this recognition as the first democratic president to do so, and you shouldn't take that lightly. So I want to take you back. I want to talk now about the two-state solution. I want to take you back. Middle of 2000, Camp David collapses, and then Clinton, strong friend of Israel, comes out with his own two-state solution map. And that's this one here. That's, of course, the West Bank. These white patches are about 5% of the area of the West Bank. 86% of the Jewish settlers live in those patches. Clinton says that will become part of the state of Israel. The Palestinians will get about 3% of the inside Israel profit to compensate for that land. And the problem was, we accepted that. The problem was that Israel was hit by a metaphorical bulldozer. I mean, the Palestinians didn't accept this plan. So if they were not willing to accept this plan, what were they willing to accept? And that's why there's so much unity in Israel today, because for 21 years, Israel is recovering from the shock of the Palestinians not accepting this and having a greater understanding that we're not talking the same languages there. We're talking about 1967, what to do after the Six-Day War. They're talking about 1948, that the whole of Israel was created in sin. We're not discussing the same topic. And that has unified Israelis till today, and why you've seen largely Likud-type governments running the country, because if they didn't take this, then what would they accept? So when talking about the external factors, there's the Palestinians, but their leader, Mahmoud Abbas, of course, different from Mansour Abbas, not related, is a damaged quantity. I mean, Hamas showed in the war with Israel that they really are the leadership. Abbas canceled the elections because he was worried Hamas would win. There are daily demonstrations in the street now against Mahmoud Abbas. So we have a problem. Who should we talk to at the moment? Hamas don't want anything from us that we can compromise on. Even if you accept that the Palestinian Authority is a partner, they don't have a leader with legitimacy now. And the real question is what to do about, and I put in inverted commas, the settlements. And this is a map that's, you may not see the map a lot, but you're going to have to become familiar with the concepts in the map. For those who speak Ivrit on the talk this evening, area A is Arabim, Arabs. Area B is Biyachad, together. And area C, we say Selanu, which is a plan Shalanu, which means ours. But to explain what it means, and you need to follow this map. That's the whole West Bank, or Yudav Shomron. The areas of dark brown are the high concentrations of Palestinians, and they're administered in full control by the Palestinian Authority. So we say Arabim. Biyachad, together, the light brown patches are Palestinians. By the way, no Jews live in Area A or Area B. The administration of Area B is together. So the Palestinian Authority has some control and the Israeli government has some control. And Area C, which is approximately 60% of the West Bank, but mainly desert, is under Israeli control. It's where all of the Jewish so-called settlers live. They all live in Area C. And depending on how you count it, somewhere between 50 and 150,000 Arabs live inside Area C. And the whole discussion inside the government, that inside Israel, is what to do about this. So there are various plans. I mean, if you look at the Tzal Smotrich on the extreme right, in opposition now, he wants to annex the whole thing. But even Naftali Bennett, who's the most right-wing in the current government, doesn't want to annex Area A and B precisely for those reasons we've been speaking about. Doesn't want to have a demographic time bomb. Wants to annex, I say only, Area C. And then you go Lapid, who wants to keep all the settlement blocks and so on. But it's all about Area C in this government. And we'll come back to that in a little more detail. But of course, the biggest external factor, for those of you who are lost in space fans, danger, Mr. Smith, the biggest factor is Iran. Now, Iran is controlling both Hamas and Hezbollah, but also the instigator of most of the terror around in the surrounding countries around the Middle East and elsewhere. And that's a really big issue. And how Israel will deal with Iran and this government, of course, will be a big question, and a little more on Iran later, but not too much. So I want to go back to the two-state question. So even the Trump plan, Trump, the most supportive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even the Trump plan is still a two-state solution of some degree, if you don't want to call it state, an entity. All of the green space would be part of the Palestinian entity. Israel has to agree to give up 70% of Judea and Samaria, Yudah v'Shomron. Remember that Area C is 60%, but under the Trump plan, we only keep 30%, not 60%. So only half of Area C have to agree, as I said, to a Palestinian entity. And the big difference between the Trump and Clinton plan, Clinton, we get 5% of the West Bank, under Trump 30%. But the really big difference is that we keep this area here, the Jordan Valley, etc. And this is a big security barrier. Before, the Palestinian state would have gone right up to the Jordan River. So you can see that the Trump plan is the best example of trying to solve the situation with both demography, separation of populations, and security, giving Israel increased security. It was not the most advantageous plan for the Palestinians, but they rejected it out of hand. And didn't come back with a counter offer. So I just want to bring you an extract from a coalition agreement between Lapid and Bennett about Yudah v'Shomron. And it's ensuring Israel's national interest in Area C of the West Bank is under full Israeli security and civil control, allocating resources to the Defense Ministry to beef up enforcement against illegal Palestinian construction in Area C. So even in this government, which includes RAM and which includes Meretz and which includes Labor, Area C is becoming the national interest, the whole of Area C at the moment, and a particular move to stop increased illegal Palestinian construction in Area C, because Palestinians are coming from areas A and B and building inside Area C. And if we're going to retain all or part of Area C eventually, again, we've got that demographic issue. So it's very important to understand that this government is into keeping Area C. Now, on the 23rd of June, this government, with RAM and Meretz in it, for the first time in 6 months, approved new projects in Area C. These are the final approvals, but they're not just apartments, and that's something that's also important to understand. It's a mall, schools, synagogues, and apartments. And it's now about building community life, not just apartments in the middle of nowhere, but actually building a life. And that's this government. So it's another one of the ironies that this government could do, what Bibi Netanyahu, by the way, didn't do for quite a long time. And another test that this government faced was on the 27th of June, an illegal, unauthorized outpost called Eviatar. Eviatar is in Shomron, had been set up and taken down a number of times. Once it was taken down by Bibi Netanyahu, or more than once. This time they came in larger numbers there. They were testing out this government. Bennett is committed to supporting the settlers, the rest of the government less so. And it was supposed to be evacuated on 27th of June. Was it going to be evacuated? How was it going to be evacuated? But in the end, the settlers left peacefully. A compromise was reached. Promises were made. We're not even sure who won out of all this. Of course, Netanyahu says the settlers lost because they got shifted out and the promises won't be kept. Of course, Bennett says the promises will be kept. And the promises are quite vague. For 6 months, they're going to look into whether it's private Palestinian land or not. But nevertheless, this government passed this test. And I think that that's also an important pointer to the fact that it can do quite what is considered right-wing steps without itself falling apart. Of course, the Abraham Accords were really probably the most outstanding thing that Trump had achieved on behalf of Israel. Remember that the Palestinians were offered that deal that I showed. They chose not to accept it or come back. But what they lost was their veto over Israeli deals with Arab countries. And of course, the Abraham Accords deals with 4 Arab countries were amazing. And now you have Yair Lapid as the foreign minister trying to take over from where Netanyahu left off. And he actually was in the UAE only a week ago. But he also was keen to tell these people that the problem or the reason there isn't any improvement in the Palestinian situation or in dealings with the Palestinians is the fault of the Palestinians, not really what you would call a left-wing speech. In the UAE, he said Arab partners like the United Arab Emirates cannot play a meaningful role in improving conditions in the West Bank and Gaza if the Palestinians don't want to work towards this goal. He said, in the end, the Palestinians themselves have to want to move forward. That's not the case right now. He didn't say that at home in the private, study. He said that in the UAE at a public press conference just a week ago. So we have to understand, he also, by the way, was magnanimous, as he should have been, and paying tribute to the role that Netanyahu had played. And that went down very well as well. Of course, now this government is trying to work on other deals, whether they can make them or not. Well, we have to wait and see. And now I want to come to the most difficult thing that this government has faced today. And again, it revolves around security and demography. Now, so do we understand the background? In the 10 years from 1993 to 2003, about 130,000 Palestinians entered Israel via family reunification. What that means is that Israeli Arabs married a non-Israeli Arab who then, by virtue of that marriage, came into Israel and either sought permanent or temporary, either citizenship or permanent residency, and about 130 Palestinians did that. Now, 2003, we're dealing with the height of the Intifada. And what they found was in the Intifada that about 155 individuals involved in terrorist activities actually obtained entry under the family reunification laws. And indeed, one of the most horrific suicide bombings in Haifa was one of those 155 individuals. Now, they weren't all suicide bombers. They were all different levels of terrorist activity. But you can see developing here 2 problems under the security and demography question. Now, the Shin Bet estimates that in the time since then, about 200,000 Palestinians would gain Israeli citizenship or residency every decade, were it not for a piece of legislation that was being debated in the Knesset last night. Now, that legislation is called the Citizenship and Entry into Israel Law. It was passed in 2003, and it had 2 aims. One was to stop the security issues of family reunification, but it had another aim of stopping the demographic percentages in Israel changing dramatically. You can imagine if you get 200,000 Palestinians coming in every decade, that, again, the Jewish majority would get decreased. And on 2 days ago, on the 5th of July, Yair Lapid said that this law is a very important law because it's one of the tools designed to ensure the Jewish majority of the state of Israel. Israel is a nation state of the Jewish people, and our goal is it should have a Jewish majority. But just in case you're in any doubt, Blue and White leader Benny Gantz, who's the defense minister, has said, the decisions law was crucial for preserving Israel's Jewish and democratic character. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to have too few Jews and too many Arabs in the country, you're either going to endanger the Jewish or the democratic nature of the state of Israel. And so this Citizenship and Entry into Israel law, which was enacted in 2003, lasts for 12 months and needs to be renewed. And it's been renewed every year until last night. Now, can you imagine in this government, you've got Meretz and Ram. Now, Meretz is not, it doesn't have as part of its platform anymore that Israel has to be a Jewish state. And Ram, of course, is opposed to Israel as a Jewish state. So how would they support this legislation? And then you've got on the other side, you've got the Likud, which is the major opposition party, which was the party that brought the legislation in and which has supported it every single year, now wanting to embarrass the government. And of course, the other Arab party, which is in the opposition, not being in favor of this law either. So now you see under the character problems of demography and security, this government faced its first real crisis. The vote took place and it was 59 to 59, which means it didn't pass. But by the same token, it didn't mean the fall of the government. But from the government side, remember there are 4 members of RAM in the government, 2 didn't support the bill. But from Bennett's own party, 1 also didn't support the bill. The Likud, which has supported this bill since 2003, voted against the bill, even though they really support it and have done so since its inception, because they wanted to embarrass Bennett's and Lapid's government. So you have a major issue here of a bill which is really, was non-controversial amongst, let's say, at least the Jewish Zionist parties, now being a flashpoint for controversy within the government. And in the end, as I said, you have the irony of Likud and the Israeli Arab Party, the joint list, voting together and cheering, both of them cheering the loss of this legislation. And so you can see how tenuous Bennett and Lapid's majority really is. I mean, anything can bring it down. So in my final slide, what is the future? I don't know. This government can break apart at any time, but it can also last for some time. And I don't have an answer to that question. Now, it's got a lot of implications for Netanyahu in both the short and long term, because if Netanyahu wants to come back, he has to do so in the relatively, well, he has to say at least leader of the Likud, let's put it that way. Now, he faces one danger that the current government may pass legislation, which it's threatened to do, to limit service to 8 years as a maximum, in which case Netanyahu would be allowed to run again. But his bigger problem is that he faces internal issues in Likud. I mean, the longer he sits in opposition, there are already 2 declared candidates to replace him, self-declared candidates. One is Nir Barakat, the ex-mayor of Jerusalem, and the other is Yuli Edelstein, the ex-speaker of the Knesset, both strong candidates, and both have already indicated that they'll run against Netanyahu for leadership of the Likud. The longer, as I said, he stays in opposition, the more endangered is his continued political life. I think if delivered, as I said already, I think before, the possible biggest achievement of this government would be the change in the position and status of Israeli Arabs, how Jews look at the Israeli Arabs and how Israeli Arabs look at the Jews, and how, in a practical sense, Israeli Arab life improves. And I think that the government has to, as I said before, last a period of time for that to happen, but that could be really possibly one of its biggest achievements. Now, it can also do a lot to heal Israeli internal fault lines. When you're a government as broad as it is, and I indicated much earlier on that they're not that far apart on many of the internal issues, here's a chance to heal a lot of those internal fault lines, which have been exaggerated or exacerbated over the last 12 years. That really would be a wonderful thing if this government could do it. There's also the delicate question of how to deal with the Haredim. I know a lot of people like to take a black and white view, excuse the pun, on the Haredim. It's not that simple. Now, Avigdor Lieberman made as part of his coalition agreement deal that he's the finance minister. He wants to stop stipends to Haredim, but also he's done it to people who are voluntarily unemployed, as he calls them, not Haredim, other people. And this government will try, I hope, I think, to deal with the question of Haredim in a nuanced way, not necessarily for them to serve in the army, but perhaps to do a form of national service, some vocational training, but they need to be dealt with. They're part of the fabric of the state of Israel. They serve one extremely important role in the state of Israel, going back to demography. They have more kids than anybody else, we ignore them at our peril. The other big change that this government will do, if it lasts long enough, is to change relations with the United States. Now, under Netanyahu, it became more and more polarized with the United States. It was great whilst there was a Republican president. A little bit problematic when it was Trump, because Trump was, again, a lightning rod that you either loved him and therefore loved everything, or, hated him and therefore hated everything that he did. And it was hard to get other world support. But at the end of the day, we all know in a realistic sense and the same is true in Australia and everywhere else. The different parties come and go in power, and Israel really had less connection with the Democrats. So they'll work very hard, this government, to improve relations generally with the US and with the Democrats. And coming along with that, something that I think is even perhaps more important, and arising out of that, is relations with US Jewry and hence diaspora Jewry. Now, 70 whatever % of American Jewry vote Democrat. Whether we think that's funny or not, I don't mean funny, haha, but we think that's odd or not, they do. That's how they vote. And they're generally liberal-minded, and they generally saw Bibi Netanyahu as a Trump replica because they didn't like Trump, and they're less familiar with Israel than Australian Jews are. They didn't like Israel, or had questions about Israel with Bibi's leadership. And here's a chance to repair that relationship. And one of the big changes will be that this government will also recognise the streams in a much more way. By that I mean progressive, reform and conservative Jews, and probably bring back the egalitarian prayer space at the Kotel. So that could be a very positive thing. But the biggest, largest problem that they have is what to do about Iran and the JCPOA deal. We should understand that the Israeli security establishment, in the main, wants a deal with Iran, but they want a different deal than the one that Obama agreed to. Now, whilst I've been praising Biden in part for what he did during the Hamas war and other things, when it comes to Iran, removing the sanctions rather quickly wasn't a positive move. But almost everybody that is put in the Iran negotiating path are old Obama people, which would tend to indicate that maybe it leads to the old Obama deal. Now, of course, Iran wants the old Obama deal, but how they deal with this issue of Iran and America, and how they go about trying to convince the American establishment not to go back to that Obama deal, but to go for a better deal, and whether they're successful is going to be a huge marker of this government, because everybody will be comparing them to, were they better than Bibi or worse than Bibi? You know, would Bibi have got a better deal or not? So they're going about it in a different way, in a quieter way. They're not trying to embarrass President Biden, but whether they'll be successful or not, I think is going to actually be the marker for, or at least a marker for, whether this government will have popularity and be able to continue. Because this, if they come out of this well, it will give them a great amount of legitimacy. If they come out of this perceived to be badly, well, it's easier for it to break apart. It's harder to bring down a government that is seen to be successful. And I think that finally, the final point would be that whilst Israel's government has been a mixture of functional and dysfunctional for the last 2 years, in the short time they've been there, which is, as I say, less than 4 weeks, it's given a degree of confidence that it can be a functioning government. It has carried out, it's starting for the ministries to operate properly once again, and it's got time now to pass a budget. I believe there was just a vote in the Knesset that gave them a bit more time to pass a budget, to prepare a budget and then pass it. And I think that we don't know yet where this government will go, but it has a lot that it can achieve. And I think that we're looking for a period of stability. So on that note, I'll end the presentation and switch back to you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so now's the time for anyone that has questions to please type them in the bar. I do have a question here. You kind of did touch on it, but I'll read the question out. Should Israel grant Israeli citizenship to West Bank Arabs who marry Arab Israelis?
Well, that's what the vote was about. You know, if you want Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state, the answer is no. If you don't mind about Israel retaining a Jewish majority, then the answer is yes. But at the end of the day, the Israeli government, and in normal circumstances, let's say all of the Zionist parties, let's leave Meretz out just for the moment, definitely don't want to. And that's why for 20 years or 19 years, this law is passed every single year with a large majority, because Israel is focused on keeping the majority of the population Jewish so it can remain a democratic state. I mean, if you imagine that 50% of the population would be Jewish instead of 80% of the population, 78% of the population. I mean, and it's a democracy, it's the end of the Jewish state. So remember that I said that the purpose of the Jewish state, it's not just to exist. The purpose of the Jewish state is to be able to secure and determine the Jewish future. If you want that, and we all believe in democracy, you need a very large Jewish majority. 200,000 Palestinians a decade coming into the state of Israel is not going to help that situation at all.
Thanks, Ron. Do Israeli Arabs have the same rights as Israelis no matter where they live in Israel?
Yes. The answer is yes. Now, what you can ask is, that's under the law, right? So yes, under the law, they absolutely do. As I said, do they have poorer infrastructure in Israeli Arab towns? The answer is also yes. But under the law, they have absolute freedom. You know, there was a lie put about some time ago that, you know, Israel had Jewish-only roads, as an example, which is not true. But what Israel does have is Israeli citizens-only roads. But if you're an Israeli citizen, 20% of the population is Arab, you can go on the same roads as any Jew, which you should be able to do. So, I mean, you know, listen, we have sitting in the Israeli embassy here in Canberra, finishing her term, the spokesperson for the Israeli embassy is an Israeli Druze lady, a wonderful person. I don't know if you've heard her speak or not. Her husband is the military attaché. He's also Druze. The Jewish agency, the Sochnot, which I'm a member of, sent now its first Druze shlicha to the United States. So, I mean, the Knesset has, you know, as I said, 2 Israeli Arab parties. There are Israeli Arabs who are members of Jewish parties. There's an Israeli High Court judge, as we know, an Israeli High Court judge, an Israeli Arab High Court judge sent an Israeli president, Moshe Katsav, to jail. So yes, the answer is legally, the Israeli Arabs have exactly the same rights as Jewish Israelis. All Israeli citizens have the same rights.
Thank you. Isn't the citizenship law also designed to keep terrorists from Palestinian territories out of Israel?
Yes, so I described I don't think whoever asked that question maybe joined later, but I described that it was a security thing, that 155 of those Palestinians who came over under reunification laws participated in terrorist acts. If you remember, I described the fact that one of the worst, the most horrific terrorist acts in Haifa took place during the Intifada, the second Intifada, by one of those Palestinian Arabs who came in under the family reunification law. So it's the twin aims of this legislation is to increase Israel's security and to increase Israel's, or to keep Israel's demographic formula as it is.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I saw that Sue had a question, but I couldn't see the question.
Now that the reunification law has failed to pass, does that mean that the law cannot be revived and that all Arab spouses will now get citizenship?
No and no. So the Israeli law can be revived, but what it means is that now the Interior Ministry, which is under Ayelet Shaked, who is one of the members of Bennett's party, will have in a administrative sense to decide on every single application on its merit. So one can assume that Interior Ministry will not allow a flood of people coming in, but it'd be more difficult for the Interior Ministry to justify its decisions. There'll be more challenges to the High Court because there's no law backing up the Interior Ministry's decisions. But what I assume will happen is that in the interim period, some compromise will be worked out, some law will be passed, and that eventually, again, it'll be business as usual. But in the interim, it makes life harder for the government, and it means the government is going to have to justify why it didn't let, Mr. or Mrs. X into Israel without a law saying that they can't come in.
And the opposite. So what if an Israeli Arab wants to marry someone from the West Bank and live there? What rights would the Palestinian Authority then give them?
I think they'd be delighted to have them. I don't think that any Israeli Arab is going to give up Israeli citizenship and move to the Palestinian areas at all. But I have no, direct knowledge of any of that. But the movement is always from the Palestinian territories or the, Yudav Shomron, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it, into Israel, not the other way around.
Israel,
I think I told the story in previous times that, there's a Israeli Arab journalist, Khaled Abu Ta'ameh, when he met an Australian foreign minister once in the past, she said, Khaled, when there'll be a Palestinian state, you'll move there. He said, are you crazy? There's no, we don't have rights in a Palestine. There's no Arab or Palestinian. Let me put the other way around. Arabs have more rights in the state of Israel than they have in any Arab state. Correct. They know the reality. There is not a mass migration from Israel into the Palestinian territory.
Thank you. And what about Israel-Europe relations under the new government?
So I sort of alluded to it, that Trump was wonderful, as I said, with the Abraham Accords in particular, of course, with recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which I accept was a great thing, but not as good as the Abraham Accords, in my view. The problem with Trump was he alienated everybody else, and he alienated the whole of Europe. So, it didn't bring Europe along. So, on the other hand, Biden, as we saw in the recent war with Hamas, and those who participated in that discussion will remember that I pointed out that, the Austrian Chancellery displayed the Israeli flag, the home of Hitler, displayed the Israeli flag and said, we stand with Israel. The German foreign minister flew to Israel on Thursday night before the ceasefire, which took place on the Friday, whilst the rockets were flying, and stood there and said, we stand with Israel. Europe, not just Eastern Europe, but Europe is a better partner to Israel under a Biden administration than it would have been under a Trump administration. And I think that Lapid, who is very urbane, very suave, very intelligent, will make an excellent foreign minister. He's got a lot of experience. He used to be a reporter himself. And relations with most countries will be much better, I believe, provided this government has a chance to carry it on. Look, the tonal change of the government. I tried to point out during my presentation that in policies, it's not going to be a huge change. It's not like we moved from an ultra right-wing government, which previous government was not, to now an ultra left-wing government, which Bennett and Lapid are not. So it's the way it will be presented and the way it will be described and the way it will be likely to be accepted. It doesn't mean we reached now some golden period, but things will be easier.
Thank you. Is the Australian press, this is from Rolene in Israel, is the Australian press covering the anti-Abbas protests where the PA has been exceedingly brutal towards protesters?
Not really. Not really. It's not a news story here. I saw it today in the Herald in a small section. No, not really.
Okay, thank you. And can you tell us something about the two Likud politicians who may oppose Netanyahu?
Well, the three richest members of parliament are Nir Barkat, Yuli Edelstein, and Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett is a self-made multimillionaire. Nir Barkat, likewise. Yuli Edelstein is a complex character. He's an ex-refusenik. He's highly regarded in Israel. Unfortunately for him, his wife passed away. But when he remarried, he's remarried the daughter of Leonard Nevzlin. Leonard Nevzlin is one of the oligarchs that fled Russia and makes our relationship with Putin a little bit complicated, but makes Yuli Edelstein and Nir Barkat two people with extremely large resources to back up their campaigns. They're both experienced politicians, particularly Yuli Edelstein. Nir Barkat is a little more of an outsider in the Likud, but they both have a lot of experience. Barkat is considered to have done a great job as the mayor of Jerusalem. Yuli Edelstein has been around a lot longer. in politics, and is very popular in the Likud. They're neither of them openly challenging Netanyahu at this point in time, but they have declared that they would. And you have more and more voices inside the Likud saying, you know, if Bibi wasn't the prime minister, if Bibi wasn't the leader of Likud, Likud would still be in government, and so on and so forth. If you're asking about their policies, Barakat is a pro-capitalist, free market, liberal leader. He's not religious, but he managed to be the mayor of Jerusalem and have Haredi support. So, you know, that is a talent in itself. As I said, Yuli Edelstein is a widely respected person right across the political spectrum, very smart person, and has a great understanding of, as I said, Likud internal politics. But Bibi's not done quite yet.
Thanks, Ron. Just a couple more questions. Now that Biden won't replenish the Iron Dome missiles, does this pose a risk?
Why won't he?
Well, he won't.
Well, no, he will. On the contrary, Biden did two things during the Hamas war, or the war with Hamas. One was he passed an extra missiles appropriation bill in the United States, despite his left flank, where $720 million worth of extra missiles he was sending, and he gave a commitment to replenish Iron Dome completely. If something's changed since then, I'm unaware of it.
Okay.
But no, he's been magnificent in the military support that he's been given to Israel. And now they've only also just reapproved the appropriations bill of $3.3 billion. So I don't think there's any question there of support. But if I missed the story that he's said he was going to not replenish Iron Dome, I'm sorry, but I have heard zero about that, only the opposite.
Okay. What do you think will happen with Mahmoud Abbas and the PA?
So, look, it's the Palestinians' eternal problem. He's an illegitimate leader. He was elected in 2005 for a 4-year term. He never went to election again. He's not popular in the Palestinian street. They need someone like Marwan Barghouti, who sits in an Israeli jail. Sometimes he's called the Palestinian Mandela. I don't know. But until the Palestinians can get their act together and work out what it is that they want, and want to worry about their own future more than trying to deny the Jewish people a future, their situation is deteriorating. They've lost Arab support. As I said, they lost their veto over Arab countries doing business with Israel. Israel now has treaties with 6 Arab countries. None of them were endangered during the war with Hamas. None of them threatened to break off diplomatic relations. Yeah, of course, some were critical and they voted against us in the United Nations. But I mean, it's remarkable how I wouldn't say they didn't care about what was happening to the Palestinians, but the Palestinians are not the cause celeb in the Arab world anymore. The Arab countries have bigger problems, i.e. Iran, and the Palestinians have to find a new strategy because the strategy they have isn't working. They need new leadership, and they need a leadership that's popular and credible and that can actually make a deal with Israel, or at least some sort of arrangement with Israel. At the moment, Israel's biggest problem is it hasn't got anybody to talk to, neither with Hamas nor with the Palestinian Authority.
Thanks, Ron. And the last question, is the new government going to deal more thoroughly with the scourge of anti-Semitism in the diaspora, especially in the universities?
I think the question is how. Is there all the governments have a department that deals with anti-Semitism. I don't know if people have an answer to how to deal with anti-Semitism. Certainly the government, and this started under Bibi Netanyahu, and Bennett was the head of this department in Netanyahu's government. It started a diaspora affairs budget of $80 million a year to start activities and programs in the diaspora, working with the Jewish Agency, sometimes filling in the gaps of the Jewish Agency. It's a joint project between the Jewish Agency, the Sochnut, and the Israeli government to send, coronavirus got in the way, but we've just sent 1,200 young Israelis to the United States, to the summer camps, and then many of them will stay on in campuses. It's a different problem in the United States than it is here. And it's a different problem in South Africa, for instance. It's a terrible problem in South Africa compared to here, where you have a government that, you know, is institutionalizing anti-Semitism, if you like. But the question really is how. You know, I mean, Ehud Olmert said on the 60th anniversary of the State of Israel, for 60 years, the Jewish people or the diaspora built the State of Israel, and now the State of Israel is going to build the diaspora. You are dealing with a government that is larger than it's ever been in terms of its budget, in terms of its capabilities. And I think that there's a great will with Bougie Herzog moving now from the head of the Jewish Agency to the presidency, with a great feeling for the diaspora, with a great understanding of the diaspora, and at the same time with an Israeli government which is looking to repair relations with the diaspora. There'll be a lot more cooperation. I don't think really, as I said before, the question is, will they want to do anything about fighting anti-Semitism? The question will be how. And the main thing that Israel will do in this regard is sending out emissaries, but young people on the campuses. We have a problem in Australia because it's the Australian government that doesn't let people in. It's not that Israel doesn't want to send them, but we have almost no shluchim left in Australia because of the COVID restrictions, and we're missing them. And I think that the more that anti-Semitism is tied up a lot with anti-Zionism, and the more that Israel's image will look better, will also be a huge step forward in delegitimizing at least more of the anti-Semitism that masters anti-Zionism. But it's a very difficult problem.
Thanks, Ron. Someone snuck another one in. Any further on the ICC investigation?
No, so we have a big problem with the ICC, of course. We have a new prosecutor, a British man. We don't know his stance on this issue. We do know that the ICC generally does not investigate countries where it feels that the countries have a legitimate and a authentic and a strong internal investigation process. We can be very proud of one of our own Australian, Olim, Ben Walhouse, who's very high up in the Military Advocate General's office in Israel, a high-ranking officer, a lawyer. And I know that they're working extremely hard on trying to demonstrate to the ICC that there's no reason or cause to investigate Israel. We are lucky in the fact that we're strongly supported by a number of Western countries, including Australia, who've protested to the ICC at investigating Israel, and countries like the United States, which have a high degree of self-interest in not being themselves investigated by the ICC. So don't want to see a precedent being set by Israel being investigated. Primarily trying to convince the ICC that democracies, as I said, with authentic internal processes, shouldn't be subjected to ICC and was never intended to be subjected to the ICC. So the answer is we don't know where we stand, but a lot will depend on the new prosecutor, who Israel, at least the press claim, is thinking in the correct direction. But, you know, time will tell on how that pans out.
Thank you, Ron. Oh, thank you for all those great questions, and thank you everyone for Zooming in. Ron, once again, thank you for your continued support. You are the most amazing Meetzo man, always there for us. Just, you are so brilliant with your updates and always keep us informed. So a huge, huge thank you from all of us here at Weiser. We really appreciate it. I also just want to say a quick thank you to Lorna and Chagit, who have just been amazing with tonight, getting everyone organised, sending everyone their links and emails. So really, toda rabah. And I just wanted to mention to everyone before we sign off that we have our major gala coming up with an incredible guest speaker at the end of August. Invitations are going to be emailed and sent out later this week, next week. So let's hope this COVID quickly disappears, although I don't know how quick that will be. So everyone be safe, stay well, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.